You ever walk into a store or scroll online and felt completely lost picking up a laptop? You're not alone. Between confusing specs, dozens of models, and clever marketing, finding the perfect laptop might feel impossible. But by the end of this video, you will know exactly what to look for. Whether you're working, studying, or gaming, you will never waste money on the wrong laptop or computer again. Hi, my name is Pedro and I'm a software developer that has a passion for electronics in general. I love computers, so when I was looking about buying my first laptops, I would always look up online and try to understand what all those specs would mean. And unfortunately, I did a lot of mistakes in buying just by the specs and actually not seeing the overhaul of the things. So today I will break down how to pick the right one for you in plain English. The first step is simple. Forget about brands, specs. Think about you. What you're looking on in a laptop or desktop. Do you want portability? Do you want more battery? Do you want to be able to play games? Because depending on the dynamics of how you're using that device, it will matter a lot into the specs, into the decisions that you will need to make eventually. So for example, are you writing essays or you're just using the browser most of the times? If you're editing videos or if you're playing games, all of those little choices, they make a huge impact on the last and final choice. Let's understand the core specs of a computer. So computers form of motherboard, CPU, GPU, RAM, and memory, which can be SSD or a hard drive. So what is a motherboard? Motherboard acts as a central hub. It's where all of the hardware and components will connect to communicate between themselves. So the things that are connected to your motherboard is the RAM, is the memories, either SSD or hard drive, is your GPU, is your CPU. So choosing your motherboard will also be very important into how your computer will perform. So for example, you can have 64 gigabytes of RAM, but if your motherboard only allows 32, that means that the extra 32 that you have is gonna be wasted because your motherboard has that maximum capacity for RAM. So the CPU is your laptop brain. It's where all the logical, the computational things will happen. So basically over here, as a consumer base, you'll find the most three influential and famous brands. The first one being Intel, the second one being AMD, and the third one being the MacBooks by itself, right? Because they have their own CPU, their own GPU, unified core, now with the M series chips. So in this case, you don't need to go necessarily by the brand because, for example, MacBook, it just works for MacBook, so you will need to buy a laptop. But for the CPU, you can search things like how many gigahertz and as well how many cores there is that specific CPU. For the CPU, I don't need to go into many details. You can always use ChatGPT to help you out to understand a little bit better. But basically, you're looking for two things. How many cores? Because CPU is divided in cores, so the more cores, the more multi-threading will happen and the better it is for your computer. And another thing that's important as well is how many gigahertz your CPU can run. So RAM is where your short-term memory lives. So when you're opening browsers or dealing with applications, all the things will be using a little bit of RAM. So usually what we are looking for is something more than 8 gigabytes. So in this case, the more RAM, the better. Usually what you can look for is for 16 gigabytes of RAM that will give your computer a good briefing when dealing with heavy applications that are intense in memory usage, such as Final Cut or Google Chrome. All of these deal sometimes with a lot of RAM. Usually what I would recommend is you buy your computer as base as it is, if you're buying a Windows laptop, and then you can just buy an upgradable version of the RAM that sometimes is even cheaper than upgrading by the website. So GPU is in the charge of the graphics. So if you're rendering video editing tools, or if you are gaming, or if you're using 3D design, all of those applications, they rely heavily on graphics. So what better than a GPU to deal with that? In this case, GPU will kind of overperform and pick some of the tasks that will go directly to the CPU, and they will deal with these tasks better because they have a more advanced processing in regards to graphics. The only downside over here is that if you're talking about gaming laptops, most of the times these GPUs, they're not as good as the desktop GPUs because they don't have the same size. They're the mobile, the compact version of that GPU. A stronger or dedicated GPU will give you higher frame rates. That's great for gaming. So we have now the SSD and the hard drives. Most of the new laptops, they come with SSD because it's faster than a hard drive, basically a solid state memory, instead of having the disk itself writing all the changes. What I would strongly recommend is checking if your laptop has additional storage. Usually most of the newer laptops, they have additional storage for NVMe, which is a very small form of SSD, and if your computer has that ability, then you can expand your storage as well by adding the SSD NVMe, which is amazing, even faster than the normal SSD. So before we go into the next step, what's the overall good combination over here? If you're just using for studying, I would just try to have a good amount of RAM, because sometimes you have many tabs or many applications running, and a good between 512 gigabytes of SSD, because for me that's more than enough to basically deal with my day-to-day basis, even with programming as well. Usually if you're doing content creation, I would say a minimum of 16 gigs of RAM and a 512 gigabytes of SSD would be enough, because most of the times as a content creator you have an external SSD instead of having a huge memory inside your computer anyway. So if you are a gamer, I would recommend the minimum of 16 gigabytes of RAM. Of course, I would strongly recommend trying to get 32. In terms of the storage, I would recommend having at least 1 terabyte of storage, but if you're a heavy gamer, trying to get at least 2 terabytes of storage on your computer. I wouldn't recommend having an external hard drive for gaming. You need to have everything installed on your computer, so then the games will render faster, because if you have an external hard drive, the transfer speeds of your SSD will also interfere into your gaming quality. So just trying to have everything into your laptop. So if you are always on the move, weight and battery life matters more than raw power. Ultrabooks or MacBooks can last up to 10 hours without a single charge, while gaming laptops will maximum last for 5 hours. So if you decide you'd rather to use your computer away from the plug for long hours, I recommend having a MacBook in this case. So here's the secret. Timing is basically everything. So if you're looking up to buy your next laptop, buying on Christmas or in specific promotions or events, or even buying the previous version when a new version is launching, is usually the best times to buy your laptops with the most discount possible. So how would I choose? I would break down between 3 different categories: work, study, and gaming. Work, I would choose a MacBook. Study, I would choose a MacBook. And for gaming, I would either choose a desktop or a console, PS5 or Xbox. So let me break down now why I choose like this specifically. So over the years, I've had a variety of Windows, Linux, and also Mac OS systems. So I have the Acer Predator Helios 300, Samsung notebook. I've worked with ThinkPad, Lenovo, HP, so many others, Dell, so many others that I cannot even count. For me, usually what happens with Windows is doesn't matter the spec, eventually some apps will start crashing, and that is a pain in the ass. Sometimes if you're in an editing workflow or if you're programming like me, you don't want things to crash, you just want things to keep working. And that happens with Linux that happens on Windows and fortunately happens way lesser on Mac devices. The main reason is Windows is a very open ecosystem, so it allows you to have different hardwares and different devices that are compatible to Windows devices. And this is very nice. You can use AMD, so many other different brands of hardwares. While on MacBook, unfortunately, you're tied to that ecosystem. You cannot even change your RAM or your CPU or your memory, now with the new M series. But I feel that maybe because they actually do this, it makes their computers quite fast, reliable, and the battery lasts almost forever. Is by far the laptop with the best battery performance that I ever had. And I'm using almost every day for at least 6-7 months, and the battery is still rock solid, better than any of my previous laptops. And this all come down for one main factor. macOS is very restrict with the way people should develop their apps, with the way their ecosystem works. So yes, Windows has its own advantages. So for example, macOS, you don't have a Windows management. You have to either download an app to do that for you, or you don't have actually. You can use spaces or hot corners, which is different features that macOS gives to you. But one thing that really made me switch when I bought my Mac Mini and going to my MacBook is that I really love the way I can use apps like, for example, Final Cut or just browsing or programming without crashing, without worrying about things will eventually, stuck and it won't work. Basically, everything just works. I don't need to remember to restart my computer. I just charge it, use it, and that's it. This is why, even though Windows has its own strengths, I will still pick any day, every day, macOS. So to sum up, know your needs, match your specs, and buy at the right time. I will link a few of my favorite picks for each category below. If this video has helped you, please comment, like, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and good luck finding your perfect laptop.